You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Hello, it's Teresa Tang. The CNA correspondent team will be taking a break for a few weeks in December, but we will be back in January 2025. We're also putting together a special Asian Tsunami Anniversary episode, which will be coming out soon. You don't want to miss that. In the meantime, we're bringing back some of the more memorable episodes from this year, just in case you've missed them. Have a listen and enjoy. Hi everyone, I'm Teresa Tang. You know, the job of a journalist can sometimes take you to interesting places you least expect, places like this.
Pope Francis has concluded his 3-day visit to Singapore. Let's cross over to Leong, who's already on board the plane and waiting to take off with the Pope.
We will be taking off from Singapore to the Vatican, and I must say that this is the first time that I'm crossing to you from the studio in an airplane that's about to take off. Talk about epic experiences. Now,
how cool is that? The Pope was recently on the longest apostolic journey of his papacy, an 11-day tour of 4 countries in Asia and Oceania: Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Singapore. Pope Francis was not alone. A group of about 80 journalists traveled with him, literally on the same plane as him from start to finish. And our Leong was one of those journalists. He joins me today for a behind-the-scenes episode I am so excited about. Let's get to it. Wykit, hey!
Hi!
So I knew you'd been given this assignment weeks and weeks ago. Right away, I approached you. I said, buddy, you have to tell me everything that happens on this trip, because it's not every day you get to say, I traveled with the Pope.
Exactly, and now I can say I traveled with the Pope. So yes, I first got the assignment, I think sometime in July, and that was when I was really busy preparing for a trip to Laos, where I was slated to cover the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. My boss called me and said, can you make time in September? I have an assignment for you. And I thought, what sort of assignment could that be in September? And then he said, you're going to be traveling with the Pope. My first reaction, Teresa, really was like, I am going to be traveling with the Pope. I was so excited. After we hung up the phone, reality set in, and my reaction was, oh no, I'm going to be traveling with the Pope. Because, trust me, it took me 6 years and counting to be an expert on Myanmar, which I'm covering. It took me 3 years and counting for me to be a specialist in ASEAN. I only have, 2 months to get to that level, and I was so stressed. But I did what every good journalist would do: research, homework. And I feel that if my expertise in Myanmar were, say, a master's course, then this one is a degree course condensed into 2 months. And I had to do it part-time because I still had my Myanmar work, ASEAN work, and my Johor work to do. But there's nothing hard work and formula can't solve. The other aspect to it was the paperwork involved. My boss and I were just joking about how if Moses can part the Red Sea, please let them cut the red tape, because there's so much involved. Because
visas, right?
Visas, 4 countries. Each country has different requirements. Of course, I'm Singaporean, so I don't need a visa in Singapore when the Pope comes here. There are certain countries that require me to apply for a diplomat visa. Some countries say journalist visa. Some countries say we don't need you to have a visa. That's one. The other thing is, because the security is so tight, we have to decide there and then how many pieces of luggage, hand carry and check-in we are bringing.
Wow.
And we have to submit the number of luggage that we're bringing so that it can give us specific luggage tags, so it's easier for security clearance. We have to give our laptop model number, our phone details, because it is that secure.
And you were not alone. You had a partner in crime, cameraman Ashraf Suhaimi. So what was it like on board for the both of you? You know, did the Pope fly in first class? What sort of security detail was there on that plane? And how much did the pontiff actually interact with you guys?
Right. We know Pope Francis is a simple man. He wears simple robes. He does away with lavish luxury treatments. But still, when you travel and it's a long-haul flight, you naturally take the ones in front, which is spacious, business class, first class. But he did make it a point to come to our economy class to meet journalists. In fact, I knew he would do that already, because in the course of my research, everyone who has interacted with the Pope would say that, he would take time to meet everyone. True enough, he did. I mean, in my job, I've met so many people from all walks of life, from your everyday person on the street to celebrities to politicians. But meeting him was different because he had an aura about him. But, well, he has an aura, he has no airs. He walks around, talks to everybody, and you know how sometimes when you speak to friends, you know that they're not paying attention to you. whatever you say to them, it just flies past them and they just gaze at you. The Pope does not have that. He's very in the moment. And that's despite language barrier. So you know that he meets tens of thousands of people in the course of his papacy. But whenever he has time with you, you get that there's a connection. Wow. There's eye contact, and you know that he's listening. Some of the journalists, if not most of the journalists, are actually Vatican-based, Rome-based journalists, and they specialize in covering the Vatican. So some of them have met the Pope several times, and the Pope, of course, sees familiar faces. And of course, I don't understand what was being shared. But later on, they tell me, whenever the Pope meets a familiar face, he would tell them a joke and they would laugh. So there's a lot of laughter in the plane. But I'm like, what's going on, you know? But later on, people tell me, the Pope is joking with some of the familiar journalists whom he's met before. And he just, makes his way very slowly around the plane. And mind you, he's been traveling with a wheelchair because, he has joint pain. But on that flight, he was holding on to chair after chair after chair for support to just slowly walk his way around to meet people. And that took not just effort, but I think physical demands on him.
Mm-hmm. Considering today's taste for luxury, it is so refreshing to hear someone of his stature being so ordinary, right? A commercial plane, nothing too VIP. And it seems like that was a theme that you saw throughout this trip.
Absolutely. I mean, everywhere we go, people were excited to see the Pope, naturally so. The faithful, some flew in from other countries just to get a glimpse of the Pope. And he will be so accessible. He sits in the front of the car, windows wound down, and then he waves. And I remember this particular incident where I felt compelled to share because that was in Jakarta and there were throngs of crowds waiting for him. And mind you, it's extremely hot and people were standing there for hours, right? And then when the Pope came, he was visiting Our Lady of Assumption. He reached the church. Then after that, of course, he took a small tour. And the people were across the street from us. But the moment the Pope came, they were allowed to come nearer to the church. And that was when he made a special effort to go to the gate because he knew people had been waiting for him for a long time. So that people can come as close to him as possible. And he waved to them. And to me, it is this human connection that makes people love him. And of course, there are other interesting observations that I made. There was a family, 2 young children. The older brother looks to be about 6 or 7, younger one, 3 to 4. I was from across the street, but I noticed that the older brother was wearing Pope robes, a small Pope.
Like dressed up like the Pope.
Exactly. And the younger brother was in priest's robes, the black and with this white collar. And I was like, this is interesting. Of course, there were also volunteers who made time and used their expertise. Right? For instance, there was one Indonesian student who spoke fluent Italian and he volunteered his time to help with translation. There was one who spoke fluent German, and of course there were also German journalists with us, and they want to be involved. And so it all ties back to perhaps the Pope's charisma, where people think that regardless of whether I'm Catholic or not, I want to be involved in this historic moment. This is not just a Catholic event, it is a world event. So when I was planning for the trip, there were many things that I have wanted to do. For example, go to a certain place, film, speak to people. But you are there in Rome. You are visiting the Vatican. So there are several things I wanted to do, such as when you're in Rome, eat like the Romans do, right? So I made sure I had pasta. I made sure I had pizza. I made sure I had espresso. I made sure I had gelato. And then when news came that, the Pope had a soft spot for gelato, he had asked for his freezer to be stocked with gelato while he was in Singapore. I thought, maybe we ate the same type of gelato. I don't know. The other thing that was quite memorable was in the papal plane from Rome to Jakarta. The food was, oh my goodness, the food memorable, right? But what really stood out for me was the tiramisu. It was so good. I mean, I have lived a long life. I've eaten tiramisu, but I've never eaten something so good. And I literally told the air stewardess who collected my plate and I said, the tiramisu is so good.
The sense that I got watching your reports was that, the compassion, the thoughtfulness that the Pope displayed to the people who were waiting for him was actually reflected among the people as well. And you had so many stories of that.
Yeah, and I remember feeling so hot in Timor-Leste because the stadium where the papal mass was held was outdoors, no roof, and there were maybe 600 to 700,000 people all waiting in the extreme heat. I mean, look, I'm a very outdoorsy person and I'm used to running in the heat. But that heat, when the sun's rays hits my skin, it actually hurt, right? So there were 2 things that I observed. One, I mean, yes, everybody had an umbrella, and they were all the, Pope Francis umbrella, shades of white and yellow. And there were security officers who were in full suits. I kid you not. And I'm like, I had a suit because I had to do a piece of camera, but I didn't wear it. And I was already feeling so hot. And I spoke to the person. I said, how long have you been here? He said, I've been here since about, a few hours ago. And his entire stint as a security personnel, he would have to stay in that situation. In the sun, in that full suit for about 6 hours. Wow. No complaints at all. He felt that it was a normal thing to do. And the other thing I noticed, which I was so moved, was when Pope Francis reached the VIP area, he was on a platform, everybody else was on ground level. The moment he reached there, everybody else kept their umbrellas because the umbrellas would block people behind the view, and they kept it. Of course, what was extra special to me was when he came to conduct papal mass in my own country, in Singapore. Let's take you to that very moment where you will now hear the voice of a translator during the papal mass.
Sometimes the greatness and grandeur of our projects may make us forget this and fool us into thinking that we can be sole authors of our lives, of our wealth, of our well-being, of our happiness. Yet, ultimately, life brings us back to one reality. Without love, we are nothing.
Now, before he embarked on his tour, the Pope had asked the faithful to pray for him, to pray for a safe journey. And Waikid, his trip was not without security concerns.
Oh, yes. I mean, we know that the Pope has received numerous death threats since he became Pope. Of course, it was still a surprise to me, to all of us, in fact. And here I want to talk about the timeline of events, right? So, we were in Papua New Guinea already. We've taken off from Jakarta to Papua New Guinea. And the Pope has already left the tarmac in Papua New Guinea, left for his lodging. And the journalists were already in minibuses going to a hotel. That was when news broke that Indonesia had arrested 7 suspects for making threats against the Pope. And so, of course, if you look at it, you sort of can safely assume that Indonesia made sure the Pope has left Jakarta safely, reached Papua New Guinea before they made this public. What's even more interesting is that the threats, the comments were made, the arrests were made on September 3rd, 4th, and sometimes even 5th. That means that the Vatican must already be aware of the threats. And so, if you take a step back and you draw these connections and you feel that some of the comments that the Pope made is not without meaning. For instance, he visited a mosque, and that was after the arrests were made. He visited a mosque, he signed a joint declaration with the Grand Imam of the Istiqlal Mosque in Indonesia. And one of the news points that stood out to me was that the Pope said this joint document will have to be like a reference point for interfaiths to look at in the event of a dramatic crisis that divides people. We'll have to fall back onto the document, use that, and then forge a path forward, reconciliation. Like I said, the Vatican must fully be aware of those threats when he was at the mosque. During the papal mass in Jakarta, he had some comments. And of course, he thanked the Catholic community. He thanked the president of Indonesia for hosting him. And he also singled out the security officers in Indonesia. He thanked them. Now, if you have no background or context, you would say, the Pope is a humble man. Of course, you thank people for helping you. But then you look back and you join the dots. You must then imagine that the Pope had extra meaning when he thanked the security officers. As my colleague Saiful pointed out, the Pope, regardless of whatever threat was made against him, was so accessible to people. He was not afraid. And throughout my time in Indonesia, I've never once felt that there were such threats because there were many sightings of boots on the ground. Police either doing their part for crowd control or heavily armed officers around. And you would think nothing of it because this is the kind of security we accord to high-level personnel when they visit a certain country.
The Pope's trip wasn't all about religion, though. Of course, like you say, there was the message of inter-religious harmony, strengthening the fabric of society. But there was also a lot of talk about climate, right? And that is close to the Pope's heart, one of the signatures of his papacy, in fact. And he also put a lot of focus on young people.
Yes. So, I sort of see the pattern in his four-nation trip. Whichever country he goes, he would find the characteristic of that country to relay a message so that it is more relevant and relatable. So in Indonesia, where most people are Muslims, his theme was interfaith dialogue to foster stronger ties between Christianity and Islam, as well as with other religions. So that was a very strong theme there. In Papua New Guinea, the message of climate change and sustainability was very strong because Papua New Guinea is a place rich with natural resources, and it was there and then that he had cautioned international firms against exploiting the riches and the resources of Papua New Guinea. And if you do want to harness any of those resources, make sure that people's interests are put first. In Timor-Leste, that's a majority Catholic country. Of course, he tapped a lot on the faith of the country. I mean, Timor-Leste is a very special case because during its fight for independence, the Catholic Church had played a very strong role in helping them to push towards peaceful path of independence. And Pope Francis is coming at a time that is post-independent. So a lot of the priests, nuns back then, when Timor-Leste was still fighting for independence, they were seen as having risked their lives to protect civilians who were all under Indonesia's rule. And so they are very much respected. So you have that extra significance of Catholicism in Timor-Leste. And so when Pope Francis was there, he tapped on that. He had asked people to tap on their faith and use that to find new solutions for challenges that they are facing now, post-independence, such as poverty, gang violence, education. And of course, when he was in Singapore, he talked about how he was impressed by Singapore's skyscrapers, our modern city, as well as our inter-harmonious fabric. Because, we have so many races and religions living peacefully together. And of course, he was literally driving home the message of sustainability because he was literally in a green vehicle whenever he moves around in Singapore.
Some wondered, myself included, if Pope Francis would address that sex abuse scandal that has plagued the Catholic Church. Wykit, how did he handle that?
I would say touch and go, because he did not evade the question altogether. He did not evade the topic altogether. In fact, he was the one who brought it up while he was in Timor-Leste. And Timor-Leste has had a history of high-profile cases of priests having molested young children. One of the more famous cases was Bishop Bello. And it's complicated because the people in Timor-Leste still regard him as a national hero. He, in fact, won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts towards helping to push for peaceful independence of Timor-Leste. So if you speak to the Timorese, they still regard him as a national hero. But the Vatican had confirmed a few years ago that he was placed under disciplinary actions. He was not allowed to go back to Timor-Leste. He's now in Portugal. But Pope Francis did not name names. All he said was that children had been abused. He didn't even use the word sexually abused. But if you read into his message, you know that he's talking about these abuses. And in his papacy, he has made it very clear that there is zero tolerance, and if there's a probe involved, it will be made full transparent. While we were on the plane back from Singapore to Rome, a reporter had asked about sexual abuse, right? And Pope Francis didn't run away from the question. But what's interesting is he uses his own way to address issues. So after the question was posed to him, and of course, like I said, the press conference was in an airplane, there was turbulence. An announcement was made by the pilot to say, buckle up. And he said, I only found out later because I couldn't understand Italian. He made a comment and everybody laughed. I found out later that the comment was, oh, your question caused a turbulence. And everybody laughed. But he did not shy away from talking about the thing. But this again tells me that this is in line with the Pope's way of handling issues.
To cap things off, the Pope held a press conference on board the plane, which is what you referenced, at the end of the trip. And I just can't picture that, right? Help me wrap my head around that. How do you have a press conference in such cramped conditions? And what did he say at the end of this amazing journey?
Right. I mean, you're not alone. I know the end product would be a press conference on the plane. So I was also wondering, how are they going to set it up? So first, they asked one of the passengers to, clear that overhead compartment of your luggage. And I'm like, okay. And then they put speakers. So they place speakers strategically on several areas so that the microphone is linked to those speakers and it's easier for me to listen to what's being said. Of course, that's moot because I don't understand Italian, right? But the sound system was set up there and then. And then journalists who will be asking questions, they would then be asked to sit nearer to the Pope. And once you're done with asking your question, you make way for the next journalist and so on and so forth. So that's that. Once that's settled, the Pope comes to the front of the economy class, sits down, And he makes his remarks. I was extremely, extremely anxious because in a normal situation, whenever a press conference is being held, I take notes immediately. I can tell myself, this is a soundbite that I want to use. This is the lead that I want to go. I was completely helpless. There is camaraderie, and there's a system to the whole thing. The Italian-speaking journalists who are fluent in English tell us, don't worry. This is what we're going to do, right? There'll be 1 or 2 people tasked with translating everything. So once they're done with that, somebody will compile from question 1 to question whatever, and then in a thumb drive, passed around to the non-Italian speaking student. And I am so thankful. I've never been so happy to receive a thumb drive in my life.
And it's such a stressful situation. Yeah. And when you have these, I guess they're colleagues, right, in the air helping you, that just makes it so much easier and enjoyable. Okay, last question. And I want you to answer this question first as a journalist and then as Waikit, the person. So after you said farewell to the Pope, you had time to digest everything, including the gelato, which I hope you're going to talk about. What was the main takeaway for you?
As a professional, it's a very easy answer. No matter what task is given to you, no matter how challenging you think it is, how significant, how daunting, or how much imposter syndrome you have, as long as you use this tried and tested formula, which is hard work, you will get there. And then personally, and this is particularly moving for me, during the 4-nation trip, of course, we went to most of the places that the Pope visited. The one that stood out most for me was when he was in Singapore and he visited an elderly home. When I stepped into that home, there was this sense of familiarity that hit me. I can't put a finger to it. And then while waiting for the Pope, I walked around and then I saw staff tending to the old people there and I saw the living quarters, and then it hit me. I don't have amnesia, but this is a memory that I shelved away because we're talking about 30 plus years ago. I'm now 45. Suddenly, a memory from when I was 14 came back to me. And then I remember that was when my first brush of volunteer work happened when I was 14. And that was my first encounter with very old, very frail, very vulnerable, and old people who were abandoned by their loved ones. And I started my volunteer work as a 14-year-old at such a home. And then I started thinking, this is something that I've actually forgotten about. And I just allowed the memories to come back. And I remember there was this old granny who couldn't speak. She's bedridden. She could only make noise. And every time she's alone in bed, she gets anxious and she would shout for attention. And one of the sisters would then go to her bedside, hold her hand, and then pet her, assure her that you're not alone. And after a while, I learned how to appease Granny Aoyong, right? Whenever she makes noise and there are no sisters or volunteers around, I would just meekly creep up to her bedside and just stand there. At 14, I did not have a heart big enough to hold her hand. So I just stood there like a statue, but she saw me. And there was eye contact. And then she quietened. And I thought, okay, I did my part, right? And when I recalled these special memories, I smiled. And then I started tearing because I realized that I now have the maturity, the wisdom, and the words to analyze my 14-year-old experience, because my very foundation of what's important to me, compassion, humility, moral courage, and forgiveness, sort of started from there. And back then, I felt all these emotions, but there were no words to describe it because, 14-year-old, after your school holidays are over, you go back to school and then you have school camp and then you grow up, right? But when I allowed myself to remember all these memories, I was very moved because I sort of remember that, this is what made me as a person. Emotional moments, happy moments, all in it was a great experience, unforgettable.
Absolutely. This was such a physical and emotional trip for you, it sounds like. Thank you so much, Waikit.
Pleasure is mine, Teresa.
A reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And you can find all of Waikit's reports from this journey on YouTube and on CNA.Asia. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and me, Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining us.